It's Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. This is the Torah portion uncensored section of the podcast. Before I begin, if you like this podcast, please leave a review, subscribe, like it wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else. Thank you so much. Now, the Torah portion at hand is Ki Tavo, or Ki Tavo, and it starts off chapter 26 in Deuteronomy, Perek Chaf Vav in Dvarim, and it talks about the commandment of the mitzvah of Bikkurim. And Bikkurim is the mitzvah of the first fruits, that when you come to the land of Israel and you have a crop and you take the first fruits and you bring it up to Jerusalem, to the place which God had chosen, which is Jerusalem, and you bring it in front of the priest, and the priest places it down in front of the altar, and there is a declaration or a prayer which is said at that time by the person bringing up the Bikkurim, the first fruits. And then after he's done that, he then eats the first fruits in Jerusalem. So this is something which is a ritual and it's done yearly. And I want to delve into this declaration which is said by the person bringing up the first fruits, because it is different than all other parts of the Torah. I'm going to compare it also with the declaration which is made in the next section, which is the declaration which is said when the person brings the tithes up to the temple. So let's start off with the declaration which is made by the person who brings up the first fruits to Jerusalem. Chapter 26, verse 5, Perek Chavav, Pasuk Hey. It says, V'nisava Marta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Arami Ovid Avi Vayered Mitzrayim V'yogasham Bimsei Ma'ot V'yihisham L'Goy Gadol Otzim V'rav. And you should respond to the priest, in other words, and you should say in front of the Lord your God, our father was the lost Aramean, and he went down to Egypt, and he sojourned there, few in number, but there he became a great and very populous nation. And the person who brings up the first fruit goes on, and he says, Vayireo sonu hamitzrim vaya'anunu vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. And then he continues and he says, V'nitzak el Hashem Elokei avoseinu. And we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. Vayishma Hashem es keleinu. And the Lord heard our voice. Vayar es onyenu. And he saw our plight. V'esam aleinu. And our misery. V'es lachatzeinu. And our oppression. Vayotzienu mimitzrayim b'yad chazak of zarnetuya of a meragadol of a oisais of a moifsim. And the Lord took us out from Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and awesome power, and with signs and with wonders. Vayivienu alamakim hazeh, and he brought us to this place. Vayidin lanu es haaretz hazois, and he gave us this land. Eretz zavas chalav udvash, land flowing with milk and honey. And now he concludes and he says, V'ata, and now, hine hevesi es reishis pri ha'adama, I bring the first fruits of the soil, asher nasata li Hashem, which the Lord has given to me, v'nachto lifnei Hashem Elokecha, and I place it in front of the Lord your God, v'shtachaviso lifnei Hashem Elokecha, and bow before God your Lord. V'samachta b'chol ha'tov, asher nasan lecha Hashem Elokecha, olveisecha ata v'halevi v'hager asher b'reglecha. And you shall enjoy, together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst, all the bounty that the Lord your God has bestowed upon you and your household. That's the declaration which he makes. Now, some of this we're very familiar with because it's found in the Haggadah of Pesach, which we say on Seder night. It has a whole section of this. Why? Because it tells some of the history. The history of the Israelites started from the ancestors who went down to Egypt and ended up being enslaved there. And then God took the Israelites out with an outstretched arm, with wonders and with miracles, and ended up in the land of Israel. And now look, we have this bountiful produce. How amazing is that? And you can rejoice with all the bounty and all the good that God gave to you and your household, and to the Levite and the stranger that is in your midst. What's really interesting about this is that there really isn't any kind of precedent in the Torah for this type of declaration, this kind of prayer. It is very different than every other kind of prayer. Yes, it is mentioned in other parts of the Torah that you should tell your sons on that day, and you should explain to them that God took the Israelites out of Egypt, etc. All that exists. But to my knowledge, this is the only ritual which has this type of declaration, giving the history of the Jewish people and telling the story as if the whole enterprise of the initial oppression of our ancestors, including the slavery in Egypt and the bringing out of the Israelites out of Egypt and taking them into the land of Israel, all led up to this one thing, so that we should have these first fruits and we should enjoy the land in this way, and now we're enjoying the land with this first fruits. It is especially jarring when you look at the declaration which is made in the next section, where it says in verse 12, Pasuk Yud Beis of Perek Chavav, it says, Ki sechala la'aser es kol ma'aser tvuoscha b'shana shlishis, shnas ha'ma'aser, v'nasata Levi lager layosim v'lo almona v'ochlu b'sharecha v'saveu, which means when you've set aside in full the ma'aser, the 10th part of your field, in the third year, the year of ma'aser, the year of tithing, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat their fill in your settlements. Then there's a declaration. So when you bring this ma'aser and you give it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, then you make this declaration. And again, it's similar. You say it in front of the Lord your God. In verse Yud Gimel, Pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13, it says, and you should say in front of the Lord your God, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayis, v'gam nasativ la'levi, v'lager, la'yosim, v'lo almono, k'chol mitzvoscha, asher tzivisoni, lo yavarti mitzvisecha v'lo shachachti. Which means, I've cleared out the consecrated portion from the house, and I've given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, just as you commanded me. I've neither transgressed nor neglected any of your commandments. And then he continues saying, Lo yachalti v'oini mimeno, v'lo vi'arti mimeno b'tamei, v'lo nesati mimeno lameis, shomati b'koil Hashem Elokoi, osisi k'chol asher tzivisoni. I've not eaten it while in mourning. I've not cleared out any of it while I was impure. I have not deposited any of it with the dead. I have obeyed my God. I have done just as you commanded me. Then it finishes off and it says, Hashkif men kachchem in Hashemayim, uvarich esamcha es Yisrael, v'eso adom asher nasata lanu, k'asher nishpat alav v'seinu eretz zovas cholav v'dvash. Look down from your holy abode, from heaven, and bless your people Israel, and the soil you have given us, a land flowing with milk and honey, as you swore to our fathers. And that's the end of that declaration. Nothing to do with any history. It's just saying, I did what I was told, I followed the commandments, and now please look down from your abode from heaven and bless your people, Israel, etc. Very, very different declaration. Similar kind of concepts. You're bringing up some kind of offering to the temple, and you're making a declaration, but the declaration is very different. The declaration of the Bikkurim is the historical story that he's saying. This is what happened. This is how we came. This is how we got here. But that kind of declaration is not said with tithing. Why not? Why the difference between these two declarations? And specifically, whenever there are types of declarations which are found, for example, the declaration with regard to the Egla Arufa, which is what happens if a person is found dead between two cities, and we're not sure which city it comes from, there's a declaration which is made with regard to that. And that declaration is also a declaration that we didn't kill this person. In other words, the elders of the city go out and they say, we didn't kill this person, we weren't involved with the death of this individual. So declarations exist, and declarations are usually some kind of commitment to God, or a declaration related to not having done something or having done something properly. But a declaration when it comes to the first fruits is a declaration of history. It's a declaration of what God did for the Jewish people. It's starting from when the Arami Ovidavi, our father, was a lost Aramean. And then we were a small number of people who went down to Egypt and we were oppressed there, etc. It's a historical declaration. Why that historical declaration? So it seems to me two things we can say here, both very instructive. The first thing, why is the first fruits such a crescendo of the whole enterprise, starting from Arami Ovidavi, starting from our father was a lost Aramean? Unlike other formulations of religion, which put front and center, and perhaps as the most important part of it, a ritual or some kind of spiritual journey or some kind of spiritual cleansing, etc. It seems that the point of Judaism is something different. It is to live successfully in this land, the land of Israel. The centrality of this land, the land which flows with milk and honey, to the Jewish religion cannot be overstated. It is fundamental to not just the Jewish psyche, but to the whole enterprise of the Torah itself. And how do you know that you've successfully lived in this land of Israel? Well, when you've settled it properly, and you have plowed the land, and you have planted the land, and the first fruit come about. And now you have those first fruit. You take those first fruit to Jerusalem to celebrate the fact that you're now living in this land and you have produce coming from this land. You are now in control of the land. You're not in Egypt. In Egypt, you had to rely on the largesse of the Egyptians. It wasn't your land. It wasn't the land of the Israelites. They were strangers in the land of Egypt. They weren't in control of the fields or of the produce of the fields. That was controlled by the Egyptians. The Israelites were oppressed there. The idea was them to leave the land of Egypt with miracles and outstretched arm of God, etc. And they came to the land of Israel, where they now conquered the land, and they're living in the land. And what's like the first day? Let's use an analogy of a play on Broadway. You have the opening night. What does the opening night really celebrate? There's going to be many nights of the show on Broadway. What's the debut? What is that first event, the opening night? Why is it so special? It's so special because so much work went into the play, all the way from the very beginning when the playwright conceived it and they wrote it down and they went and they got the financing for it. And then they went and they casted the actors, etc., until finally, in the end, they now have a play and it's opening night in the opera. That's a big celebration because Soif Maaseh b'machshava tchila, as it says. End of the action was in the thought in the beginning. When a person imagines something happening, they begin with an imagination. They begin with an idea and they end up with a practical thing happening. Now, the hope is that that thing is going to continue happening over and over and over again. It's going to be instituted for a long time to come. It's going to be a permanent fixture. But when it begins, that inaugural event, that opening night, that's the time when you celebrate. So what shows more than ever the culmination of the promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? When our father was a lost Aramean, and they went through all this trouble and difficulty of the enterprise of becoming a nation, the success of it is the first fruits. Another thing I would point out, that we bring these first fruits up yearly, and we say this over and over again. It brings to mind that thing which Jeff Bezos talks about when he says that you have to have a day one mindset. Even when the company becomes successful, you still need to show up like it's day one. Every day is day one. Every day should have that excitement as if it's day one. Never take for granted the fact that the enterprise is here, because enterprises can go away. Enterprises, businesses don't last forever either, unless you make sure that they last forever. So this idea of every single year bringing up the first fruits and remembering where we came from, and remembering that we were once slaves in Egypt, and if not for God who took us out from Egypt, where would we be? And this land which we have, this amazing land, it shouldn't be taken for granted. So reminding us where we came from and reminding us that the crescendo each time is bringing up the first fruit is really important, because that way each year we come up and we have that day one attitude and we feel this is again the first fruit. It's like the first harvest, and we should appreciate it for what it is and be really excited about the fact that we brought this to the land and we have this land. It's our land, and now we have control of it. We have autonomy over this land, and not take that for granted one bit, and be thankful and grateful for the joy and the bounty that we have, and thank God that we have that, because we wouldn't have it without God. And that is what the declaration is all about. And that's why this declaration is so different than all other declarations, because it is telling us, it's teaching us something fundamental, and it's something which has to continue being thought about and spoken about every single year when we have that first fruit. Never ever to take that for granted, and to understand that it could be different. We always have to have that first day attitude. That's one way of looking at it. But I'd like to share some additional thoughts here related to this. Because what is the difference, in fact, between this declaration of the first fruit and the declaration of the tithing? I actually think, and I'm not the only one who says this, it was shown to me by my friend Yehuda Ber, that Amnon Bazek actually says a similar type of idea, but I formulate it slightly differently. If you look at the declaration the individual makes when he brings the first fruit, it's all about what God did for us. It's the history, but it's about what God did for us. If you look at the declaration with tithing, it's about what the individual did for God. So it starts off, the first section is about the first fruit, and it's about what God did for us, took us out of Egypt, etc., and now gave us this land, and now we have the first fruit. And then you have the tithing, which is we followed what God wanted. So these are two sides of a similar coin. There is a covenant going on here, and the covenant goes both ways. God does for us, we do for God. But it goes deeper than that, because if you look at the text itself, you can actually see that there is a mirror image in the text of these two things. What God does for us, we do for God. And this is really a very wonderful way of looking at this, I think. So let's take a look again at this text of the declaration. So it says, and you should respond and say in front of the Lord your God, this is with regard to the Bikkurim, to the first fruits, Aram Yovid Avi, our father was lost Aramean. And if you look at the Rashbam, he says this is talking about Abraham. Abraham was Aramean. And what happened? God said to him, Lech lecha mi'artzecha u'moladetecha. Go out of your land and of your birthplace, mibeis avicha, from your father's house, and go to the land which I will show you. So now he's left his ancestral land, where his father came from his father's house, and he's lost in a sense. He was an Aramean who's now lost. And eventually the family didn't have a place to go, and they ended up in Egypt. And they were small in number there. And they ended up being a very populous nation. But they were oppressed there. Now let's take a look at what the declaration, which is said for the tithing. Ve'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. And you should say in front of the Lord your God, very similar language. What you should say, the declaration needs to be said. What is the declaration? Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayis. I've cleared out the consecrated portion from the house. I moved the tithing out of the house. It's now no longer in the house. It's no longer where it was gathered in the first place. Conceptually similar to the idea of Arami Ovid Avi. Our father was Aramean who was lost because he had to leave the house. Similar kind of concept. And then you have this idea of V'gam nasativ lalevi v'lager layosem v'la'alamona k'chol mitzvsecha shesivisani. And I've given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, just as you commanded me. And what is this? There are people who are disadvantaged, and they need to get tithing. So this is the idea of there are people who are oppressed. They live a more of an oppressed life. So these is the same idea in a way of the Israelites being oppressed in the land of Egypt, God helping them out. Here it also talks about the people who were oppressed. And then he says, I have neither transgressed nor haven't forgotten any of your commandments. We're remembering things. Let's now compare that to the declaration which is made about the Bikkurim. So we said that the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us, which is in the Hebrew, so that is the idea which we just mentioned, that there's an oppressed people here, just like the Ger Yosem V'Almana, just like the stranger, the orphan, and the widow in the declaration with regard to the tithing. And then it says, V'nitzak el Hashem elokei avosenu, and we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, V'yishma Hashem eskolenu, V'yares onienu v'esmeleinu v'slachatzeinu. And God heard our voice, and he saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. God's remembering the Israelites, just like we said in the Maaser, in the declaration with regard to tithing, that we didn't forget. It's a mirror image of God not forgetting. And then it goes on to the next part of the tithing. It says, Hashkifim min kochcha min hashamayim uvarches amcha es Yisrael v'es Adama shenasata lanu kashenishba lavesin ezov v'schalav v'dvash. Look down from your holy abode, from heaven, and bless your people Israel. And the soil you have given us, a land flowing with milk and honey, as you swore to our fathers. So Hashkifim min kochcha, which we just mentioned in the declaration with regard to the tithing, is God looking down from heaven. And let's have a look at the mirror of that in the declaration of the Bikkurim, of the first fruits. It says, V'ata hine evesi es reishis pri adama shenasata li Hashem v'yinachtu lifnei Hashem elokecha v'shtachavisa lifnei Hashem elokecha. This is us looking heavenward and saying, don't forget, Hashkifim min kochcha, God was looking down, now we're looking heavenward. And we're saying, therefore, and here, what we have is us looking up to God when we talk about the declaration with regard to the Bikkurim. It says, V'ata now, hine hivesis reishis pri adama asher nasat li Hashem v'nachta lifnei Hashem elokecha v'shtachavisa lifnei Hashem elokecha. Now I bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, God, have given me. Recognizing this comes from God, comes from above. We're looking up and we're saying, yes, we've got these first fruits, but they come from God. We're looking up. And you shall leave before your God and bow down before your God. Subdue yourself to God, recognizing this all comes from above. Don't forget that in the tithing, it talks about God looking down upon us, remembering what we're doing for God. Here, in the declaration of the Bikkurim, it's talking about us looking up to God, recognizing everything comes from God. So to summarize, we find that the idea of the Bikkurim and the declaration which is made is very different than every other declaration which is found in the Torah. But it's a pivotal declaration. It's a declaration which needs to be made because we need to remember not to take any of this for granted. We have to have that first day attitude. And also, it's a pivotal part of the covenantal relationship that the Israelites have with God. And the text is trying to tell us that there are two sides to this relationship. There's on the one hand what God does for Israelites, that God took them out of Egypt, God heard their cry, God heard their oppression, and then did wonders and miracles for them in order they should go out of Egypt. And now here we are in the land, and therefore thank God we've got this first fruits, and we give thanks for that, and we're grateful for that. So all of that is what God did for us. On the other hand, there's what we do for God. And part of what we do for God is also, just like God remembered the Israelites, we have to remember the downtrodden as well. Part of our covenant, part of the relationship which we have with God, is that God remembers us when we're downtrodden. And that teaches us that we must remember the downtrodden. We must remember the stranger, the orphan, the widow as well. And the flip side of God remembering our oppression is us remembering the oppression of the downtrodden, of the stranger, of the orphan, of the widow. And that's part of the covenant. And when we do that and we remember them, and we don't forget all the commandments as they're related to the Levite, the stranger, and the widow and the orphan, that is when we have a successful relationship in the land. We remember where the goodness comes from. remember where the bounty comes from. We celebrate that. And then we also make sure that we take the lesson of how God acted towards us and we act towards other in that same method of kindness and that same method of generosity, remembering them, not forgetting them. And that is what brings about bounty. And that's what causes then God again to ashkifim and kachcha, to look up down upon high and to bless the Israelites. As it says in verse 15, Pasuk Tesvav, we say and we ask God during the declaration for the tithing, hashkifim and kachcha min hashmayim v'arech samchas Yisrael, ve'eis ha'adoma shenasat lanu kash nishba'ata la'vesina eretz zav scholav dvash. Look down from your holy abode, from heaven, and bless your people Israel and the soil you have given to us, the land you have given us, a land flowing with milk and honey, as you swore to our fathers. That is an internal request, prayer that we have, that we ask God for. We ask God to look down upon us and to bless not only us, but the land of Israel as well. And that prayer reverberates till this day, especially at a time when Israel is at war against its enemies. But to understand that in order to get that blessing, according to this text, it starts off with recognizing where our blessings come from and not taking the fact that we have the land for granted. And then also remembering and acting like God did. Just like God remembered us when we were downtrodden, when we were oppressed, we must remember the oppressed, the stranger, the Levite, the widow, the orphan, and give tithing to them and give charity to them. And when we do that and we do it properly, that's when we go back to having God looking down upon us and blessing us. And this is a virtuous cycle that takes place. And this is what the text is telling us, this virtuous cycle. That on the one hand, we have God having mercy upon the Israelites, taking the Israelites out of Egypt, bringing them to the land. Therefore, once that happens, we celebrate that when we have the first fruits. We thank God for that. And then we, as we live in that land, and we have crop, and we have plenty, we make sure that we don't forget the downtrodden, the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And we take care of them as well. And when we do that, emulating God in that way, then we again bring down the blessing where God looks down upon us again and make sure we continue to having that blessing. And that cycle and that flywheel goes round and around and around. And it shouldn't be interrupted anyway. And as long as we continue having that covenantal relationship continues. And that is what I think this text is really trying to convey here. So this has been Levi Brackman with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. Hope this has been helpful and enjoyable to you. And until next time.